So in this video, we are going to look at the valves that we find inside the heart to make sure that blood always goes in the same direction. We're also going to look at what we call the conduction system of the heart, which is how the heart makes its own electricity. In a previous video that you can find here on my YouTube channel, I'll talk about the 4 chambers of the heart, how are the 2 atrium different, how are the 2 ventricles different, as well as the major arteries and veins that attach to your heart. But in the case of your heart, you have your 2 atrium, which are your collecting chambers, the right atrium and the left atrium, and you have your 2 ventricles, which are your pumping chambers. And if you remember, the right side of your heart holds deoxygenated blood and is in charge of what we call the pulmonary loop. So the right side, blood comes back to the right side of your heart from your body, and it's carrying deoxygenated blood. So the job of the right side of your heart is to pump that blood to your lungs. And in the lungs, gas exchange takes place, and then the blood comes back to the left side of your heart. And the left side of your heart is responsible for pushing and collecting oxygenated blood. So it does what we call the systemic loop. And if you remember, we have a wall that goes right down the middle to separate the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart. And that wall is what we call the septum. Now, in the case of our heart, both sides of the heart, the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart, do work in tandem with each other, which means they do work at the same time. But like we said, the right side of the heart does what we call the pulmonary loop. And since it carries deoxygenated blood, that tends to be colored in blue. And the right side of the heart, the left side of the heart does what we call the systemic loop. It carries oxygenated blood. And if you remember, the superior and inferior vena cavas attach to the right atrium. Those are the largest veins you have. The pulmonary veins attach to the left atrium, and these veins are special because they're some of the only veins in your body that carry oxygenated blood. The largest artery in your body is the aorta. It connects to the left ventricle. And then you have the pulmonary arteries that attach to the right ventricle, and these are special because they're some of the only arteries in your body that carry deoxygenated blood. Now remember, all muscles work as partners. Muscles can only contract, so they have to have a partner. And so the muscles of the atrium will partner with the muscles of the ventricle. These are what we call antagonistic pairs. So when the ventricle is opening, that will create a suction, and at the same time, the atrium will be squeezing shut. So when the atrium closes, the ventricle opens, and then we have the opposite. When the ventricle closes, the atrium opens. Well, anytime something opens, that creates a suction, so we have to make sure that blood goes in the correct pathway. So our heart has doors that we call valves. And so these are basically there to make sure that blood always flows in the same direction. So, for example, when blood goes from the atrium down to the ventricle, we need to make sure that blood doesn't accidentally get sucked back through arteries. And when the ventricle is opening up, we need to make sure that blood doesn't get sucked right back up into the atrium. So in the heart, in 4 different places, we have these doors, which we call valves. They are controlled by the muscles of the ventricle. And the 2 valves we're going to start with are what we call your atrioventricular valves. Now, for many years, these were called your cuspid valves. As you can see here, bicuspid and tricuspid. However, in anatomy, we have lots of names for the same things. And so people tend to focus on the term atrioventricular valves because it lets you know where they're found. Atrio referring to the atrium, ventricle referring to the ventricles. So atrioventricular lets you know it's found between the atrium and the ventricle. We also have what we call semilunar valves. Now, the 2 great arteries attach to your ventricles. The aorta attaches to the left ventricle, and the pulmonary trunk, which splits into your pulmonary arteries, attaches to the left ventricle. So when the ventricles are opening back up, we have to make sure that we don't accidentally suck the blood back down into the ventricles. So they have what are called your semilunar valves. So taking a look at the atrioventricular valve. Again, when you look at the name, atrio referring to the atrium, ventricular referring to the ventricles. So these are found between the atrium and the ventricle. So this picture you're looking at here is as if we have cut the top of the heart off and we're looking into it like a cookie jar. And so in the case of your atrioventricular valves, like we said, they used to be called your cuspid valves. We have one valve that we call your bicuspid valve. You can see it right here. And bi, as you guys know, is the root word for 2. And it gets its name because these valves are actually made from 2 flaps. It's like having 2 swinging doors. It's also called the mitral valve. and these are found on the left side of the heart. And so your bicuspid valve is also called your left atrioventricular valve or your left AV valve. That's the one found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now on the other side of the heart, we have the tricuspid valve, and as you can see in this picture, it gets its name because it's made from 3 flaps, and it's found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay. Now, when the ventricle is relaxing, the ventricle actually has these really large folds in them that have tendons attached to them, and these tendons are called the chorda tendina. And it's just like for those of you who have attics in your house, one room will have a door and it's got a string that you have to pull down on. And you pull down on the string, the door comes down. Well, that's very similar to what's happening in your heart. Your ventricles have these cords that attach to these doors. And when your ventricle is relaxing, that means it's swelling, it's filling up with blood. And just like a water balloon, or just like when you blow up a balloon, it begins to stretch, the ventricle will stretch. Well, that will pull on these cords, and it will cause those cords to pull these valves open. And that will basically allow blood to leave the atrium and go down into the ventricle. Now, you might have heard of something called a heart murmur, and heart murmurs actually fall into this category we call valvular insufficiencies. Basically, as you can see from this picture, our valves are very much like swinging doors. And when you close your door, you want a seal to form. You don't want air to be able to, cause a draft. Well, your heart valves are the same way. And anytime those heart valves don't close correctly, and it leaves a small gap so blood can kind of leak back through, that's what we call a valvular insufficiency. The common name is a heart murmur. It's also called a mitral valve prolapse, but this is what, for those of you familiar with the term heart murmur, what those terms are referring to. Now we also have in our heart what we call semilunar valves, and semilunar valves get their name because they look like half moons, and semilunar valves are found where the arteries attach to the ventricle. And the semilunar valves are named after the arteries that they are basically the doorways to. And in the case of your left ventricle attaches to the aorta. So when your left ventricle squeezes shut, these valves open so that the blood can get pushed through the aorta. Now, when the ventricles begin to swell again, begin to fill up with blood again, these doors will shut so that we don't suck the blood back into the heart that we just pushed out. And so the aortic semilunar valve, or the ASLV valve, is found between where the left atrium attaches to the aorta. Likewise, on the left side, on the right side, we have the pulmonary semilunar valve. And this is the doorway between the right ventricle and the pulmonary arteries. So when the right ventricle squeezes shut, these valves fly open so blood can leave the heart and go to the lungs. And when the right atrium is opening, I keep getting my atriums and ventricles mixed up. When the right ventricle opens up, it doesn't suck the blood right back in that just left the heart. So as you can see here, it keeps blood from being sucked back into the ventricle when it's opening up again. So if we're going to put it all together, so if you were a red blood cell, this would kind of be the pathway that you would take. You would go from the superior or inferior vena cava, which I just do as SI, and then from the superior and inferior vena cava, a little difficulty with this, you would then go to the right atrium. As you can tell, I'm not exactly the best at this. And then from the right atrium, you would go into the right ventricle. And right here, you would have the tricuspid. I'm just going to put the tricuspid valve. I'm just going to write tri. So like I said, this is kind of difficult doing it this way, right? So you'll go from the superior to inferior vena cava into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then you'll go from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. And then this is where you would find the pulmonary semilunar valve. the pulmonary semi-lunar valve. And then from the pulmonary trunk, you would go down into the lungs. So, the lungs going on here. And that is what we call the pulmonary loop. And then from the lungs, it'll go through the pulmonary veins, which are the only veins in your body to carry oxygenated blood, into the left atrium. And then from the left atrium, we go in through the bicuspid valve. And part of the problem is I am left-handed and I'm doing this with my right hand. So I'm just going to write bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle, I'm running out of room, we go into the aorta. And the valve that we have to pass through first, down here, is your aortic semi-lunar valve. And then the aorta is going to take blood to the body. It's a really bad B. And then eventually it will make its way back through the superior and inferior vena cava. So if we were just to kind of do this part right here would be your pulmonary loop. And this part down here would be your systemic loop. And what this says right here, which is to your heartbeat and what we call the conduction system. Now, just so you'll know, this video was recorded during the COVID virus shutdown of 2020, and I am currently staying at my parents' in order to help them out, and my dad got the sudden urge to go outside and cut the grass as I am recording this. So that's that noise you're probably hearing in the background. But in the case of your heart beating, your heart has its own battery. Your brain does not tell your heart to beat. I could take your heart out of your body, and as long as it gets the nutrients it needs and gets rid of waste products, your heart theoretically can beat indefinitely. So what we're going to look at is what's called the conduction system, and the conduction system is how your heart creates the electricity needed in order for your heart to beat. Now, when you actually hear your heartbeat, like through a stethoscope, what you're actually hearing are those valves closing. Now remember, you have two sets of valves, and so when you're listening to your heartbeat, you'll go. And so when you're counting your heartbeat, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, those sounds that you're hearing are the actual valves closing. And for some reason, people call them the lub-dub. I don't know why they're called lub-dub, because they don't really sound like lub-dubs to me. But remember, the AV valves and the SL valves are open at opposite times. So when one set of valves is closed, the other set of valves are open. So when you're listening to your heartbeat, you're actually hearing those valves close. So when the ventricles are closing, so the ventricles are squeezing shut to push blood out of the heart. When this happens, the AV valves close, and the AV valves close to make sure blood does not shoot right back up into the atrium. And that's what we call the first sound or the lub of your heartbeat. And this is what we also call the systole phase. The systole phase represents when the heart is under its greatest pressure. And the heart's under its greatest pressure when the ventricles are squeezing shut in order to push blood out of our heart through the arteries in order to do the loops that they need to do. So the ventricle is closing, which we call the systole phase, in order to push blood out. The AV valves close, and that's going to keep the blood from going back up into the atrium, and the SL valves open. So the SL valves are the doors that let blood leave the heart through the arteries. Now, when the ventricles are swelling back up again, then the valves will change. So the ventricles are swelling, or what we call relaxing or opening. This is called the diastole phase. And in this case, the AV valves open so that blood can leave the atrium and go down into the ventricles. but the SL valves will close so that we don't suck the blood that we just pushed out of the heart right back into the heart. So that's the second sound you hear. So when you listen to your heartbeat, you'll hear, those are your two valves taking turns shutting. And like I mentioned, we do have what's called the conduction system. And the conduction system is basically the network of nerves and how your body creates electricity. Now, your brain and your neurons, your nerve cells create the electricity that allow our brain to talk to our bodies. But like I said, our brain can tell our heart to speed up or slow down, but our heart actually controls its own electricity. It makes its own electricity. It has its own battery. And you guys have all heard of people who have pacemakers. Well, a pacemaker is an artificial replacement for your heart's natural battery, which we call the SA node or the sinoatrial node. So as you can see on this picture here, we have the sinoatrial node, which is commonly called the pacemaker. Now, this is a bundle of nerves whose job is to basically flip on and off in order to create electricity, just like you're flipping a light switch on and off, on and off. And this sets the pattern, this sets the beat of your heart. It is found in the right atrium. And as you can see from this picture, it's actually found very close to where the superior and inferior vena cavas attach to the heart. And so as the superior vena cava pulses and the inferior vena cava pulses, remember they're made from smooth muscle, which peristalsis, that can pull on this bundle of nerves. And that basically causes this bundle of nerves to reach what's called threshold. And threshold is what does it take to turn a group of nerves on. And so when threshold is reached, it creates electricity. And so it's just like having these lightning sparks shoot out of this node. And since it's found in the right atrium, it will shock. It's kind of like shocking the cells of the right atrium. And it tells the right atrium to start to contract. So in reality, we always talk about how the left side of the heart does the same thing as the right side of the heart. Well, to our naked eye, you can't tell the difference. But in real life, your right atrium actually starts to contract before your left atrium does. Now, when the right atrium starts to contract, we have another group of nerves in that area, which are what we call the atrioventricular, your AV node, which is your atrioventricular node, which is not in the picture. Oh, yes, it is. Sorry, it's on the left-hand side. Your AV node is actually found close to the septum. Remember, the septum is the wall that divides your heart into a left side and into a right side. Well, your AV node is found in the septum between the right and left atrium. So when the right atrium begins to contract, it's going to pull on these nerves. It's going to trigger these nerves, and these nerves will create electricity. And that will then tell the left atrium to contract. So to our human eye, it looks like both atrium begin to contract at the same time, but your right atrium actually starts to squeeze shut before your left atrium does. Now, coming off the bundle, or coming off your atrioventricular nodes, you have these things called bundles of His. They're also called your atrioventricular bundles. And these are two major nerves that run right down the middle of our heart between the ventricles. Because we've just told the atrium to contract. Now we need to let the ventricles know it's their turn to contract. And remember, they do contract opposite of each other. So the SA node creates electricity, which causes the right atrium to contract, which then pulls on the AV node, which creates electricity, which tells the left atrium to contract. It then sends information, electrical current, electrical impulses down what we call the bundles of His, or the AV nodes, or excuse me, the AV bundles. And the AV bundles branch as they pass down through the septum. And these branches are called Purkinje fibers. And Purkinje fibers actually bury themselves inside of the ventricle muscle tissues. And that's what triggers your ventricles to contract. And in reality, both ventricles do contract at the exact same time.